Okay, well, yes, it is really a delight to be speaking here at this conference. And the topic I'm speaking on sits at the intersection of two long-standing interests of mine. The first, of course, is the discipline of history, not just the content of what happened in the past, but the methods that we use to retrieve those stories and the perspectives that we look from when we view them, and the factors that go into which stories get remembered and which get forgotten, and the interests and the ideologies and belief systems that shape the way we tell all those stories. The second interest of mine that I get to speak about in these two talks is the ministry of women. As a woman writing church history, I'm not exclusively interested in the history of women and their experiences, but I do take a special interest in the ministry of women and the part that it's played within the history of God's work in the world. And when I say the ministry of women, I mean not only the public, visible, institutionally sanctioned ministry that women have been involved in, the battles over ordination to the diaconate and the priesthood and so on, but also, perhaps more so really, the numberless other ways in which women across the centuries have served the Lord Jesus in faithful gospel partnership, and the complexities and tensions and struggles that have frequently attended that service. So I'm going to approach my topic mainly by telling stories, not because I think history is only about the narratives that it contains, but because I think that stories that we tell as historians can quite nicely illustrate and humanise the themes that we're talking about. So along the way, through each of the stories I'll tell, I'll try and bring out some particular aspect of what each person's story illustrates about the ministry of women and the task of an historian. I'm hoping, I know most of you aren't historians, but maybe I might even encourage you to do a bit of history writing of your own. Now, in this first talk, I'll be speaking about three half-remembered women. In the original publicity for the conference, I gave the first talk the title Unremembered Women, because these are women that you probably haven't read about within published histories of British and Australian Christianity. But I ended up changing the title from unremembered to half-remembered because, unlike many others, they're not completely forgotten. They're all women whose lives left behind tiny little fragments. I have been able to find their names somewhere. And they do get the occasional mentions here and there in the margins of published histories, maybe in a footnote. I want to think about the bits that have been recorded and remembered and which didn't, and do my best to help us remember them better. Then in the second talk after lunch, I want to talk about misremembered women, focusing on two women who played a part in quite a famous chapter of evangelical history, and think about the ways in which the values and beliefs of the historian intersect with the values and beliefs of the people whose stories we tell. So I'm going to start now. I should just warn you all that the first three today are all temperance advocates. That's what I wrote my PhD on. And to be honest, actually a lot of women were involved in temperance work. Christian evangelical women were. If they were involved in anything, that's one of the things that they would have been involved in. So these three were all involved in temperance work. So I should just explain what temperance is for those who might not have heard of it. So temperance was a movement in the 19th century where groups of people, not just Christians, were concerned with the effects of alcohol in society, and we're involved in lobbying for legal change, encouraging people to take a pledge not to drink. There were various forms of the way that it worked out, but so that's what I mean when I talk about the temperance movement. Okay, so the first woman, and I've just already covered all that, is Elizabeth Saunders. And there's no picture of her because there just isn't one that's been passed down at all. She really doesn't feature much in the history books at all. She was married to the second Baptist pastor in New South Wales, John Saunders. You might have heard of him possibly. And like many others, including the Priscilla, after whom the Priscilla and Aquila Centre was named, the majority of ministry that she did, or the majority of ministry we're aware of anyway, was work that she did with her husband, side by side with him in some instances, doing the same kind of work he was doing. Behind the scenes in some instances, supporting and advising him and enabling him in his service of the Lord Jesus. And not only doing, but also suffering and enduring in ways that were inextricably connected to the work that he did. In most cases, the work of women like Elizabeth, who served in ministries like this in gospel partnership with their husbands, ends up completely invisible to the historian. In Elizabeth's case, though, there are tiny traces left behind, including some fabulous letters that were preserved in a letter book belonging to her husband that's kept in the State Library in Sydney. So I want to tell her story this morning, piecing it together the best I can from the surviving sources, not because it was particularly unusual or atypical, but precisely because it gives us a glimpse into the kind of experiences that must have been common to many others whose stories are entirely lost to us. So, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was born Elizabeth Willicks in England in 1801. She grew up in Aberdeen in the north of Scotland, where her father was stationed as a lieutenant with the Navy. She married John Saunders in May 1834 after meeting him when he was in Edinburgh, already training to be a Baptist missionary. He'd been a solicitor. He decided to leave his job as a solicitor in London in the hope of serving with the Baptist Missionary Society in India. Now, I've not actually found a great deal of primary source information about Elizabeth at this point in her life, but we do know that she attended a congregational church, which is pictured. That's where they were married. And it was a church that was planted by Robert and James Halden, who led an evangelical revival in Scotland in the early 19th century. So it was an evangelical church. And judging by her actions and words further down the track, and the fact that she married a man who was so close to setting out as a missionary, it seems that Elizabeth's faith was already strongly evangelical at this stage. Now, this was a time when evangelicals were deeply concerned for the spread of the gospel into all the world and were involved in a whole host of charitable causes and at promoting justice and mercy. Even before they met, it's likely that Elizabeth had been involved, I think, in various acts of service. They got married and they moved straight to London. And basically on her arrival in London, she became an active member of a philanthropic group called the British Ladies' Society for Promoting the Reformation of Female Prisoners. It's a bit of a mouthful. Now, it was a group organised by Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker who actually did make it into the history book. She's famous for her philanthropy and concern for prison reform. As a volunteer with this society, Elizabeth Saunders would have regularly visited Newgate Prison, which is in London, and it had notoriously bad living conditions for women and children. Volunteers like Elizabeth would bring in provisions like food and clothes and teach the women basic skills like needlework. They established a school for the children living in prison with their mothers and lobbied the government for an improvement in the conditions of women in prisons throughout the country. They also visited the convict women who were being held in the prison hulks and the Thames, waiting to be transported to Australia. So Elizabeth was doing that. John was serving as the pastor of a Baptist church in an interim capacity in London and waiting to be sent to India. But it wasn't long actually before the Baptist Missionary Society came to him and said, look, there's a little church in Sydney that's pastorless and they've asked us to send out a pastor. Do you think you'd be prepared to go? And they agreed. So just a few months into the marriage, Elizabeth and John boarded a female convict ship named the George Hibbert, and they did that interestingly without financial support because New South Wales was not a missionary destination. So the BMS prayed for them and in some ways sent them out, but they weren't being sent as missionaries, which is actually quite in some ways more costly. So in order to avoid having to pay the fare for their trip out, some of their evangelical friends in London organised for John to be appointed the chaplain to a convict ship, the George Hibbert, and Elizabeth Fry actually advocated with the Home Secretary, Lord Melbourne, to send Elizabeth as a matron to the convicts on board. Now, this was actually the first time such a request had been granted. She's said to have had to plead earnestly with him for that to happen. And so it was the first time, and so that meant that both of them were being sent in the capacity of caring for the convicts, and it meant that they had free passage as well. Now the journey was, journey was arduous. Elizabeth battled with severe seasickness most of the journey, and the letters talk about her losing a worrying amount of weight. And we also know from the ship records that many others died on the way out of dysentery and other diseases, so it wasn't easy. And when Elizabeth was ill with seasickness, John actually stepped in and fulfilled some of her duties as well. So he carried out some school lessons for the women and children on deck every morning. He formed 2 Bible classes for the women, as well as conducting 2 church services on a Sunday on deck. The ship's captain later wrote that he remembered that many of the convict women were not able to read and write when they boarded the ship, but by the end of the journey, after being taught by John, they could do both. Elizabeth also, he remembered, although she was very sick, was very attentive and kind to all the women. So even on their way out on the ship, you get the sense that John and Elizabeth worked together in their ministry. And even he was filling in for her when she was unwell. And coming to Australia was a choice they'd made together. From the beginning as well, on their journey out, it wasn't an easy choice that they'd made together. Now, when they arrived in Australia, things were actually even harder. Elizabeth described the colony in some of her letters as a wilderness, like being in complete exile. She struggled with the hot climate. She really struggled with all the bugs and vermin. There's a really funny excerpt from one of the letters where she talks about how much she hates the mosquitoes, and John talks about their comical bedtime routine, which involved Elizabeth hopping into bed with the mosquito curtains drawn and John outside the curtains with a candle, smashing, and Elizabeth trying to smash as many as were visible, and then still sleeping with gloves and her head covered because of those mosquitoes. On arriving in Sydney also, you can see a picture of the convicts up there. Elizabeth was really shocked by the realities of living in a penal colony. At this stage, the convicts made up over a third of the population. And as much as Elizabeth had been accustomed to poverty in London, she still found the plight very disturbing, seeing convicts in chains on the street. And she commented actually that the conditions of the female convicts in Sydney were worse than she'd seen in Newgate prison on her visits there. She said, "You never beheld woman so degraded as she appears in Sydney streets." She wrote that to her sister-in-law. Reflecting on some of the daily difficulties they were encountering just a few months after their arrival, John reassured his brother in a letter home that, "I am happy, and so is Elizabeth, for we came out for an object, and God favours us, but we put up with some things we should have no occasion to contend with at home." So life was hard, and other things were hard too about living in Sydney. The way that they both lived out the kindness of God in their lives went far beyond these discomforts and inconveniences that they endured. There was frequently a sharp and risky edge of controversy to their ministry. There were numerous occasions when they took choices that put their reputation and respectability at risk. And at a time when reputation was everything, this was no small thing. The risk to reputation was there at the very beginning. The original Baptist pastor I mentioned earlier, John McCaig, was a figure of public ridicule and scorn. When he baptised his first converts in Woolloomooloo Bay, pictured there, a crowd of jeering onlookers gathered around to hoot and laugh, throw stones and steal his shoes. Things only got worse from there as his ministry unravelled, his life spiralled down into drunkenness, gambling addiction, debtor's prison and attempted suicide while he was in prison. So throwing a lot in with the Baptists in 1830s Sydney was not a decision to join with the beautiful people. And the causes that John threw himself into, alongside the work of pastoring the Bathurst Street Baptist Church, pictured there, and also planting a string of other ones, were frequently controversial and disreputable. The cause that John was best known for in his own time was his involvement in the temperance movement. And Elizabeth shared his opinions about the effects of the rum trade on the colony. She was shocked at the level of street violence and public drunkenness in Sydney. She wrote home about that on multiple occasions. And the temperance campaign itself was a joint effort that they were involved in together from the outset. She travelled with him, for example, when he made his first trip out of Sydney in 1835, establishing temperance outposts in places like in country towns at the time, Campbelltown and Liverpool. They were quite long journeys. And this was a time when temperance campaigners were actually finding it really hard to persuade the women of the colony to give their support to the cause, because it wasn't seen as a respectable issue for ladies to be involved in. Now, over time, actually, the work of Saunders as a leader in the temperance movement ended winning him enormous respect and recognition in his context. Public figures were full of praise for him, even if there were other powerful people who were less impressed. But he was also outspoken on issues that were less popular at the time. The most famous of these was the way that he responded to the Mile Creek Massacre in 1838, when 28 Indigenous people were rounded up and slaughtered by stockmen at a property near Mile Creek in northwestern New South Wales. Now, this was not the first time that large-scale killings of Indigenous people had taken place in New South Wales, but it was the first time that the perpetrators were held to account and charged with murder. In October, as the men were being tried, Saunders preached a sermon, which caused a massive backlash in the press. The sermon itself was actually published in another paper too. And the text of the sermon was based on Isaiah 26:21. Behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth shall disclose her blood and shall no more cover her slain. And its climax was on the collective guilt of the whole colony for the shedding of innocent blood. More than that, he actually went to set the massacre in the even larger context of the wrongs that had been done by invading the continent, stealing the land and destroying communities by introducing a whole new set of European vices and addictions. Now, this went far beyond what almost anyone else was prepared to say, at a time when even the decision to prosecute the perpetrators of the massacre was viewed as a very controversial one. And the sermon and a follow-up speech that he gave a few days later led to enormous controversy. There were threats of legal action and vicious public criticisms, particularly from the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. He attacked Saunders in a series of furious editorials, accusing him of malicious falsehood and maniacal fury before going on to say, let him keep to his pulpit and attend to the narrow circle of his own congregation. For should he persist in assuming such airs of importance as he has lately assumed in denouncing and libelling the colonists, he may rest assured that we will drive him back to his proper position in society. I should actually note that the current editor, apologised for that recently for the anniversary. But this could not have been an easy time for Elizabeth, as she watched her husband stick his neck out repeatedly for a cause that he believed in, knowing that he would find himself attacked so violently and relentlessly in response. But John and Elizabeth's marriage was clearly the kind of relationship in which they travelled side by side and talked things through together. In the letters that they wrote back home, they frequently echo one another's thoughts, and John repeatedly mentions ways in which his prudent wife had advised him on various issues. On this issue, however, it seems that prudence, as they understood it, did not stand in the way of doing what was right and just, motivated by compassion and kindness, and driven by convictions that were formed in them by the word of God. The kindness that Elizabeth and John showed to others in Sydney was deeply costly. It affected them emotionally and it affected them physically as well. Elizabeth married relatively late. She was 34 and they struggled to have children. They waited a long time before they welcomed a baby boy into their family. And finally, when he arrived, Edmund was stillborn. Now, who knows how things might have turned out if they'd stayed back home with the safety and the medical care that was available to them in London. But they must have wondered. Her sister, Sarah, actually came out in the following year. We don't know why, but it seems she arrived just in time to help Elizabeth through labour a second time. This time the baby was a healthy little girl whom they named Elizabeth, or Bessie for short. And by this time, Elizabeth Saunders was in her 40s, and this would be her only living child. Their time in Sydney, we know, also affected John's health. His letters home from his first year indicate that he'd always struggled with his health, even from the beginning of their time there. And over his 13 years in Sydney, it became worse. It seems that no diagnosis was ever made, but most people who knew him seem to agree that the complaint came about because of his excessive zeal in his labours of usefulness. And they described it as nervous prostration, as they used to call it back then. In the end, by 1847, it was decided they'd go back home to England, and after a large farewell, the family, Elizabeth, John, Bessie, their daughter, and Elizabeth's sister Sarah, who was still there, sailed back out in January 1848. They went back to London, pictured there in the 1830s. But that wasn't the end of the story. After returning to London, John worked as a solicitor and officiated as a pastor of a congregation in the London suburbs. But his health continued to decline, and he tried to conduct occasional religious services, but he was really unable to do anything in the end. And Elizabeth described him as being incapacitated by utter prostration. And he died in 1857. Up until his last weeks, he was still hoping to return to Australia, wanting to at least be put to rest in what he called that bright land. And the knowledge that he would never return was, as Elizabeth described it, his death blow. Now, John's death left Elizabeth destitute. The evening before the funeral, John's law firm partner informed her that there were no funds left, not even enough to pay the funeral expenses. And this was a shock. She lamented that, kind and generous as he was to others, he had not been able to save anything for his family, and said, "I felt stupefied and horror-stricken, and what to do I knew not, nor do I now." Now, the poor law in Victorian England was a fragile and rickety safety net, and there was a very real possibility she would end up with no home and no means of support. Her only option was to cast herself on the kindness of others. And so she actually wrote home to Sydney. She wrote to a few influential friends in Sydney and asked if they would consider raising a small subscription for her. "May the Lord direct our kind friends in Sydney," she said. "I put my cause in their hands, the cause of the fatherless and the widow." There was an overwhelming response. Her letter was published in multiple Sydney newspapers, part of that's pictured there, and an enormous amount was raised in response to the appeal. Despite the fact that it had been absent for over 11 years, people had not forgotten the Saunders family. Over 200 donations were made, adding up to over £650 in total. And that was a lot of money in a time when a loaf of bread was 7 pence and a housemaid earned £21 a year. So overwhelmed by this generosity, they actually returned to Australia, the 3 women, Elizabeth, her daughter Bessie, and her sister Sarah. And they started a small school in Pitt Street, Redfern. It was actually in the home of one of the generous benefactors. Elizabeth's daughter Bessie ended up a great deal wealthier than her mother. In 1868, she married Arthur Rennick, whose family actually owned those terraces. They'd met through Redfern Congregational Church, had been so generous to them. Arthur went on to become a doctor and member of Parliament, and so he was knighted, and she would later become known as Lady Elizabeth Rennick. But even in their wealth and respectability, the Rennicks carried with them something of the kindness that Bessie had seen modelled by both her parents and the lessons that they had taught her about the God who cares for widows and orphans. And it's another story, but plenty of legislation and things and organisations and hospitals that were set up by the Rennicks that reflect the values of Elizabeth Saunders and John. And Bessie continued to care for Elizabeth, her mother, and her aunt Sarah until their deaths in Sydney. Elizabeth died in 1878 in their home near Hyde Park in Sydney, and Sarah continued to live with them and died 10 years later in 1888. And all 3 women are buried in the same plot at Rookwood Cemetery. So you can go and, it's my photo, you can go and visit now. So that's the first woman. So a wonderful example of gospel partnership, I think. Now the second woman. I'll just have a drink. Okay, now moving on to the second woman, whose story I want to recount this morning, Mary Ann Thomas. She's a person who was far more widely known in her own lifetime than Elizabeth Saunders. But like her, almost entirely absent from the 20th and 21st century published histories. And she's different to Elizabeth Saunders because she was so famous in her day, but so thoroughly forgotten in subsequent generations. And so I thought I'd share a little of her story as a case study actually in the challenges of writing women's history and the challenges of writing the history of evangelical women from the 19th century. So she highlights a few other issues, I think. So unlike the vast majority of women at the time, Mary Ann Thomas was actually a woman who spoke publicly. She sometimes as a Methodist lay preacher, but most often as a temperance lecturer, an advocate and campaigner for the temperance movement. I can tell you later what being a temperance lecturer involved, but all sorts of scientific information about the effect of alcohol in the body, I think, as well as other things. So when I discovered her, it actually was through sheer determination to find a female temperance activist for the mid-19th century, from the mid-19th century, to use as a biographical case study for my PhD research. I was looking at the early temperance movement from the 1830s to 1870s in the actual thesis. So it was before the period where the Women's Christian Temperance Union became influential in Australia. But I did know that women were involved in the movement. In fact, they still made up the majority, but they weren't the leaders of the movement. So I just wanted to find someone who I could look at as a case study. And because they weren't the leaders, they tended to be really absent from the records. So I started to track some names of some women that did some temperance lecturing to see what I could work with. And I came across Mrs. Thomas, Mary Ann Thomas, and in the process found a mention to the fact she'd been involved elsewhere as well. So this is a little snippet from the newspaper, which says, "This evening, Mrs. Thomas, late Mrs. Stamp, for many years a laborious and successful advocate of temperance principles in England, is to deliver a lecture. And from the high opinion entertained by those who have listened to the lady in the old country, or on her last visit to Geelong, we are led to anticipate a powerful and telling address." So she was, a big name, and also she'd been Mrs. Stamp previously, which then led me to look for in other books, and I found another reference in a book about temperance advocates in the 19th century in England that spoke about Mrs. Stamp being the widow of John Stamp, and who just went off to Australia and did good work for the cause, subsequently becoming the wife of Mr. Thomas of Port Phillip. Not all quite right, actually, but yes. But the basic idea is the book sort of said she's gone off to Australia and she became Mrs. Thomas. So I found the reference and I quickly found that actually there were enough details in sources from the time that I could actually construct a story about her, but she'd been sort of left out of secondary literature. And she actually was, described as being one of the most famous women in Australia as of at the time, which is even more incredible. Bit of background. So she was born in London in 1818. She was christened Mary Ann Strickland, daughter of Joseph Strickland. But actually, just to add another name into a mix, she was probably the daughter of her mother's first husband who died, George Darby. Now, we don't know much about her early years, but the records suggest she was in London before moving to Kent with the rest of her family. So Joseph Strickland was a shipbuilder, and so he probably was working in the port there. Next thing we know about her is that she married a primitive Methodist minister named John Stamp in Kent, and he was a widower with two small girls. Later records suggest that she probably was already really involved in the Methodist Church, the primitive Methodist Church at the time, so was probably, and she was a primitive Methodist lay preacher probably as well at that stage. Now, at the time of their marriage, John already had a reputation for causing trouble amongst the primitive Methodists. He said it was because he was really into temperance. He described himself as the first teetotal martyr. So teetotalism is an extreme form of temperance, but really it's probably because he lost a lot of money on building projects. I think that seems to be the real reason. So they ended up leaving, had a few failed attempts at starting churches. They all sort of collapsed under financial debts as well. And then he died in 1847, leaving her with two little boys who they'd had in the meantime to care for. The two little girls, her stepdaughters had died at different points from other illness. It was a really tough time to be raising children. In the interim too, she was doing more lecturing, probably as a way of means of earning money for the family. It was a way that you could charge an entrance fee, and that's probably a big part of their livelihood actually as well. So she continued to be involved in temperance work. She married Lewis Thomas in 1850 in Wales actually, before coming out to Australia, and they arrived in 1854. And soon after they arrived, Mary Ann began preaching and lecturing at the invitation of Joseph Townend, a minister of the local United Methodist Free Church, pictured up there. He and Mary Ann had known each other back in England, and the Thomases seemed to have brought their family to Victoria in order to work with him. So she worked as a class leader at the Methodist Church there. She visited the poor in the area. She worked with women who were victims of domestic violence, mostly because of the drinking habits of their husbands. So she was really very motivated in the temperance cause because of that as well. And there were many opportunities in Victoria for Mary Ann to speak and lobby for temperance. It commenced with a large tea meeting that was held to welcome her to the colony in 1854. Large crowds attended as she was remembered by many who'd heard her speak in Britain and was already known as a teetotal celebrity, that's their quote. And she became well known throughout Victoria, went on speaking tours throughout the 1850s and 60s where she attracted large audiences. At one event in Ballarat in 1860, she attracted such a crowd, the building in which she was speaking partially collapsed, prompting many to flee onto the street where others were already standing. And the quote is, eager to catch some such crumbs of the discourse as might fall from the open window. So she was big. She was a big name. She was famous, but very much forgotten. In 1869, her health started to deteriorate. In 1873, a serious illness led to the loss of her voice, and she retreated from public speaking roles, but continued to support the cause. With the emergence of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Victoria in 1885, she again had a vital role. She was made Life Vice President in 1893, and this was because the executive desired to have the advice of and counsel of such a veteran in the cause. She was present at most executive meetings between 1893 and 1897, would lead the devotions at some of these meetings as well as at their annual convention. This is her in the front row, the older lady in the black there, next to the woman in the white who was her daughter, Minnie. And I really had to do a lot of detective work to even work that out, actually. It's not labelled. And I've actually, shout out to people who are interested in family history. I actually worked it out through using Ancestry and looking at her family that way. So that's her in the front there. So why is she half remembered? Mary Ann Thomas was clearly a well-known and respected public figure in her time. Her role was public enough to mean that there were traces of her story left for an historian to excavate from the newspapers and archives of the day. One of the reasons she's been remembered, I think, in a fragmentary way is that at the most basic level, there were details about her life as a married woman in the 19th century Australian colonies, which made it almost inevitable that if she managed to make it into the history books, she would at least be, at best, only half remembered. Firstly, and this seems very practical, but it's a big issue, her name changed. Women who married changed names, and any surviving record of their lives is cut into two halves by the change of name. She started her life, public life, as a single woman, Mary Ann Strickland, and then she changed her name to Mary Ann Stamp when she was married to John, and then she changed it again when she remarried after his death. So her story needs to be excavated from the surviving sources as the story of not one, but three women: Miss Strickland, Mrs. Stamp, Mrs. Thomas. And even when she does appear within the records under one of those identities, her first name is frequently veiled by the proprieties of the day. And it's not always obvious which Mrs. Stamp or which Mrs. Thomas a record or report is referring to. A further layer of difficulty is created by the fact that, like many other women who played a part in the history of the 19th century Australian colonies, the story of her life was punctuated in the middle by the event of her emigration from England to the Antipodes. And in this sense too, her life was lived in two halves. Given the strong ties between England and the Australian colonies that existed within her own lifetime, most of her contemporaries connected the two halves. They knew her as Mrs. Stamp and Mrs. Thomas, but this was quickly forgotten by later generations. But practicalities are not the only reason why women are often half remembered. History is a very subjective discipline. The question of which people are commemorated by historians is influenced just as much, perhaps even more so, by how they're perceived after their deaths. The ancient Romans, like many other ancient cultures, had a practice to which historians later gave the name damnatio memoriae, under which a politically unpopular figure after their death could have their names erased from inscriptions and their face chiselled off from statues. So here's a picture here. There's lots of examples when I started Googling this, of the Severan family. So it has Septimus Severus and his wife Julia in 199, and two sons, Caracalla and Geta. Now, poor Geta, we think, one of the sons has had his name erased, probably by his brother after his death. So that's just one example. And something similar, I think, can happen in the recording and writing and remembering of history. When a person or a movement or an institution becomes unpopular or unfashionable, even amongst its heirs and successors, and disappears into oblivion. And that, of course, can happen to men as well as women. But many of the women that I've researched from the history of evangelicalism in the 19th and early 20th century were particularly vulnerable to being overlooked or minimised because of the changing cultural fashions and values in the decades that followed their deaths. Negative towards people with religious affiliations and motivations had already begun during the lifetimes of many of these women, especially if they tried to act on those religious beliefs within the public sphere in campaigns for various forms of social reformation. And now, as many historians are eager to seek out the stories of women who've been forgotten, it's impossible to ignore the selectivity with which the subjects of biographical research are chosen and the partiality, in both senses of the word, with which their lives are recovered and related. So I actually did a quick search on a bookshop website of just some of the biographies that have been released in the last month. Now, I limited it to slightly historical ones and ones about women, but you can see there's particular types of stories that like to get chosen. And there's nothing wrong with knowing these stories, but it means that there's a very selective lens that's coming through. So, yes, actresses are popular, presidents' wives. They don't all look bad, but definitely I've noticed with my fellow historians that there's not many evangelical Christians that get chosen. So Mary Courtney Smith, I think, is my third person, and I think she's a perfect example of this. She was heavily involved in ministries in the Sydney diocese in the late 19th and early 20th century, but almost completely forgotten today. She was born in 1841 to Benjamin and Mary Mitchell in Greenwich. She married her husband Courtney in 1868 in Surrey, and they lived in London for a while where he was a commission agent or an insurance agent, and then they emigrated to Sydney via New Zealand in 1886. It's interesting actually, so her name, she sort of changed her name to Mary Courtney Smith. I'm not sure if that's because Mary Smith was such a common name, but I've not come across that before actually. So when they arrived in Sydney, they lived at Millers Point and became heavily involved as lay parishioners at Holy Trinity, Millers Point, the Garrison Church, pictured there. She actually edited their magazine, and church magazines back then were really impressive. So many pages and lots of great information, fantastic for her, an historian actually. She was also the first woman to teach scripture at Fort Street School. They were enthusiastic supporters of the Church of England Temperance Society from the beginning. They both held various official positions in the society, and they were devoted to their local branch at Holy Trinity, Millers Point. As part of the Temperance Society's work at Holy Trinity, they started a mission house connected to the church. This began as a small reading and rest room, and it wasn't long before they added 3 beds so sailors had a place to sleep. This quickly grew and they moved to a larger building which accommodated more men. 3 years later, in 1890, it was reported that the mission had received over 5,000 men through its doors. In 1890, Courtney Smith was appointed as the second chaplain to the Seamen's Mission in Sydney, which had been established in 1881. And he and Mary ministered together for 5 years to the sailors of the Mercantile Marine, overseeing and living in Trafalgar House in Princes Street, Millers Point, which is pictured there in the far centre. In 1892, the Smiths opened a home for alcoholics at Echo Point in Roseville. It's just near where the baths are now. It became known as Rest Haven, or the Inebriates Home, and offered a course of treatment for people in recovery. Now, at the time, many doctors and scientists had started using injections of bichloride of gold to treat alcoholics. The Smiths did not use this method, but instead gave them a place to rest, recover, and work, and used what was termed moral means. People entered voluntarily, and while they rose early, they swam in the ocean, they got up early, they worked until 5 with regular rest times. The property was filled with fruit and vegetables in accordance with the Smiths' belief in the importance of good nutrition. But critics, such as those at the Bulletin magazine, found a lot to criticise in this model. As one editorial writer in the Bulletin put it, the Bulletin hopes yet to see in Sydney an inebriate's home under intelligent medical management and supervised by the government. Pious laymen and laywomen of the unscientific and unimaginative teetotal faddist type must inevitably botch such an enterprise. Psalms aren't invariable antidote to the whiskey habit, and many dipsomaniacs are far too high in the scale of intelligence to find comfort in the company of the average parson and his hopelessly stupid surroundings. So they didn't hold back. So yes, but not all adherents, you'll be pleased to hear, to the Bulletin circle were equally scathing. So despite being a regular contributor to the Bulletin, and part of that circle really, the writer Henry Lawson offered another point of view, which I think is fascinating. In November 1898, he voluntarily placed himself in Rest Haven. He stayed for a few months, and his experience there actually found literary expression in his short story, The Boozer's Home. In that story, he talked about his friend who had been in the home. The home, he said, didn't profess to cure anyone of drink, only to mend up shattered nerves and build up wrecked constitutions. Give them back some willpower if they weren't too far gone. And they set my old mate on his feet all right. When he went in, his life seemed lost. He had the horror of being sober. He couldn't start the day without a drink or do any business without it. He couldn't live for more than 2 hours without a drink. But when he came out, he didn't feel as if he wanted it. He reckoned that those 6 weeks in the institution were the happiest he'd ever spent in his life, and he wished the time had been longer. He says he'd never met with so much sympathy and genius and humour and human nature under one roof before. So it's a pretty powerful testimony. So Mary also continued to be involved in the other projects as well, most notably the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She was president of the Sydney branch for 32 years. She served as a New South Wales president from 1907 to 1910. As part of her role, she advocated for women's suffrage and petitioned for local option laws and 6 o'clock closing. She spoke throughout New South Wales on behalf of the WCTU at public meetings, and it was said she was said to be a very effective speaker. One newspaper article commented that the effectiveness seemed to stem from, quote, deep feelings upon the liquor traffic that had been aroused by her life as a temperance worker in the slums of the city and the hotels. Courtney Smith died in 1915, and Mary continued on in her temperance work and a lay ministry at Holy Trinity, Dulwich Hill, pictured there. Up until the year of her death, she edited official magazines of the Church of England homes, particularly the Glebe and Carlingford children's homes. She represented those homes as a member of the Church of England's Homes Committee. When she died in 1928, the WCTU held its own memorial service for her. And her actual funeral was extremely well attended, with the Archdeacon Bertie Boyce giving the address. Now, if you look through the records of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and many of these other committees from the time, you really can't miss Mary Courtney Smith. This is how I found out about her, by just looking through the records and going, who is this Mary Courtney Smith? But like Mary Ann Thomas, she's almost completely absent from the books and journal articles written by modern historians. In fact, in her case, I don't think I've ever seen her mentioned in the history books. Part of the reason for that is the changing attitudes and emphases of the evangelical Christian community, actually I'll come back to that in a minute, across the century or two since she died. So while the causes that she campaigned for, especially the temperance cause, were seen as hugely important by evangelicals of her day, that quickly went out of fashion in the years after her death. So her story was quietly forgotten on the basis that it didn't really serve to reinforce our sense of identity or the image that we wanted to project to others. Now I'll come to this slide. But outside the church, that tendency was even more pronounced. The final decades of Mary Courtney Smith's own lifetime in the late 19th and early 20th century saw the emergence of a fiercely libertarian and frequently misogynistic strain within Australian progressive political and cultural life. This was epitomised at the turn of the century by the editorial politics of the Bulletin magazine. We already saw an example of that. And continued across the majority of the 20th century, culminating in groups such as the Sydney Push of the 1960s. So this is a picture of done by Norman Lindsay. This is fairly typical of the time published all the time in the Bulletin and other similar magazines, which presented this caricature of the Wowser, which were Christians involved in social causes. And the idea was that they were really wanting to destroy everyone else's fun. Within such circles, the legacy of temperance campaigners such as Mary Courtney Smith was distinctly unfashionable, falling as it did within the category of the wowsers that were satirised in works such as Keith Dunstan's Wowsers and Geoffrey Searle's The Rush to be Rich. And the wowsers term stuck. In the 1970s, when historians became interested in writing women's history, they were sympathetic to the opinions of the Bulletin school. Anne Summers agreed with the wowser characterisation when she discussed the WCTU work in her book Damned Whores and God's Police. So the person on the left is sort of the WCTU person. And then as they looked, historians looked for women's stories to tell, they tended to look for those who they resonated with, those women who had similar life stories to their own. They tended to look for those who had unusual or radical ideas rather than middle-class evangelical Christian women in the temperance movement or doing other things in society or at home. More broadly, the gradual and accelerating shift towards a post-Christian cultural milieu has created a state of affairs in which the great majority of 20th and 21st century Australian historians have had little interest in and little understanding of the religious beliefs of their ancestors. The consequence of this for evangelical women like Mary Courtney Smith, Mary Ann Thomas and Elizabeth Saunders is that if they make it into the history books at all, there is an almost inevitable selectivity in the way that their story is remembered. If anything at all is deemed interesting enough to merit the attention of historians, it's the work that they might have done to pave a path for women's participation in politics, or their attempts to police the morality of the general population. The religious beliefs that motivated and informed these activities, and the networks of family, friendship, and religious affiliation that enabled them are scarcely deemed worthy of attention at all. And I think our histories are all the poorer as a consequence, and our self-understanding is correspondingly diminished. So I'll speak more about the misremembered women after lunch. Yeah.